Christianity originated in the Middle East and was initially spread into Europe due to Rome's infrastructure and policies. The Roman Empire continued the expansion of Christianity, and the religion became central to the life of medieval Europeans. During the Middle Ages, Christianity underwent several changes and developments, and the religion had a lasting and commanding impact on European society. In this video, we'll take a closer look at 10 captivating facts about Christianity in the Middle Ages. Number 1. Monastic life was really popular. Although the idea of monastic orders predates Christianity, Christian monastic orders flourished throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. The surge in monastic orders was due to Christians wanting to follow in the footsteps of Christ and the apostles, who gave up their worldly possessions for a life devoted to religion. However, this was not the only reason to join a monastic order. Monasteries were relatively self-sufficient and provided food and shelter in exchange for religious and social devotion. They also offered education, meaning that it became a tradition of sorts that the second or third sons of noble families were encouraged to join the church to receive an education, since they were unlikely to inherit any lands or titles from their fathers. Monasteries performed various vital services in the community, including acting as hospitals, sanctuaries, lodging for travelers, and centers for education. They sometimes even had a hand in local politics. In some instances, life as a monk led to higher positions within the church and, by extension, in society. During the Middle Ages, an abundance of monastic orders was formed, each with its own goals and rules. One overriding theme of the majority of monks and nuns tended to be the desire for chastity as well as simpler and humbler lives. New orders were founded as old orders were perceived to have gained too much power or enjoyed too many worldly comforts. Number 2. The Christian world underwent some major divisions. The Great Schism divided the Christian world in the early 1000s. Also called the East-West Schism, the split resulted from ongoing tensions between the Latin and Greek churches. The disputes primarily concerned the authority of the Pope in Rome versus the Patriarch in Constantinople. During the Roman Empire, the Pope in Rome was one of several important bishops known as patriarchs. After Rome fell, the eastern portion of the empire became known as the Byzantine Empire. Rome tried to assert the Pope's authority over the Byzantine Patriarch, but this didn't go down well with the religious powers in Constantinople. Each church continued to recognize its own leaders, and the issue came to a head when the Roman Church excommunicated the Eastern Patriarch, Michael Cerularius, along with the rest of the Eastern Church. The Eastern Church responded by excommunicating the Roman Church and Pope Leo IX. The end of the Middle Ages was marked by another big split, the Protestant Reformation. This event was largely in reaction to what many saw as corruption within the Catholic Church. They cited abuse of power by those who held prominent positions within the Church and wanted religious leaders to stop gatekeeping Christianity. The Protestant Reformation is sometimes heralded as one of the events that brought the Middle Ages to an end, and it led to a rise in individual factions of Christianity, suggesting that no one had a monopoly on Christian worship or interpretation. Number 3. Crusades were all the rage. The Crusades were a series of military campaigns that the Pope sanctioned. They began in the 11th century and continued into the late 13th century. The aim was to recapture Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslims. Driven by religious fervor, European armies headed to the Middle East, at times killing anyone they deemed to be a heretic along the way, including Jews and Muslims. In Europe, the Crusaders were, and to some extent still are, idolized and seen as heroic adventurers. The wars also shifted focus from pacifism to justified wars, and violence was no longer considered inherently evil as long as it was performed with good intent. To a lesser extent, the Reconquista in Spain could be argued to be a religious war, although it had begun due to political expansion rather than a Christian crusade. The Reconquista was a series of campaigns that took place from 722 to 1492, intending to recapture territory from the Muslims who had arrived on the peninsula in the early 8th century. Nevertheless, it soon took on religious overtones, and many historians believe that it instilled an ideal of religious uniformity in Spain that contributed to the repression and expulsion of people of Jewish and Moorish descent. Number 4. The Pope didn't just wield religious power. During the Middle Ages, the Papacy wielded a tremendous amount of power. As well as being the most predominant religious leader in Europe, The title of Pope also carried a lot of secular and legal power. Along with power and influence, the Pope was one of the wealthiest figures in Europe, with access to land and the money acquired by the Church through mandatory taxes, known as tithes, donations, and schemes such as papal pardons, called indulgences, that were sold for a profit. The role of the Pope was such a sought-after position that noble families did their best to get the gig, most notably the Medici family toward the end of the Middle Ages. Number 5. Secular and religious power had a complicated relationship. During the Middle Ages, religious and secular power often went hand in hand, from the king's divine right to rule to the Pope's power as head of the Church. Secular and religious powers often clashed as they vied for supreme power, and the Pope's temporal authority over secular royals was often a point of contention. Although there were struggles between the Church and the European royalty, kings were not against using the Church to control the population and assert their power. A prime example of this was the Inquisitions. In the early 14th century, King Philip IV of France was growing increasingly aware of the power and assets the Templar Knights were acquiring. Furthermore, the Templars had helped him finance his wars, so the king was in their debt. Some historians go as far as to say that Philip targeted the Templars as a way of canceling his debts. Philip knew the power of the Church and had helped Pope Clement V to be elected pope. Philip wanted to create a majority of French cardinals and bring the papacy under French control. Although the Templars were a monastic order, Pope Clement V was clearly under the control of the French king, so the two joined forces to dismantle the Templars, destroy their influence, and seize their assets. To do so, the Grand Master of the Templar Knights, Jacques de Molay, was accused of heresy, sacrilege, and Satanism. In total, a large number of Knights Templar were arrested and subjected to torture in order to obtain confessions. Hundreds were executed and burned at the stake, and the French crown confiscated many of their assets and funds. The Templars were utterly destroyed, and by 1312 the Council of Vienne officially disbanded the order, with any remaining property being transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. Number 6. Christians tried to reconcile religion with philosophy. During the Middle Ages, Christian thinkers grappled with philosophical questions and tried to make them fit into their strict Christian understanding of the world. This movement, called Scholasticism, was influenced by the tradition of early Christian writers known as patristic philosophers, such as St. Augustine and Greek intellectuals like Aristotle. At the start of the Middle Ages, there was a shift in academia away from the Greek philosophers and educators. Instead, people embraced the Christian Church. In 529, Emperor Justinian closed the Teutonic Academy in Athens, causing the downfall of the physical establishments of pagan philosophy. One of the most famous medieval scholars was Thomas Aquinas. As Greek philosophical findings seemed poised to undermine Christian teachings, Aquinas was able to bridge the gap between theology and philosophy. By adding Christian principles, such as the idea of divinely revealed propositions alongside the concept of logical inference from self-evident truths, Aquinas was able to reconcile Christian ideas with so-called pagan philosophy. Number 7. The Church demonstrated its influence by building massive cathedrals. The medieval obsession with building cathedrals served several functions. Although a small faction of pious Christians disapproved of lavish religious buildings and the excess spending on construction, the prevailing sentiment was enthusiasm for honoring God with magnificent structures. On a purely practical scale, building a cathedral often sparked urban growth, and cities developed around these religious centers, which provided work for stonemasons and craftsmen. Many cathedrals were built on pilgrimage routes, attracting pilgrims to the area, which increased trade and provided an economic boost. The awe-inspiring architecture of the cathedrals, with their imposing size and beautifully decorated interiors, aimed to inspire reverence in the congregation and demonstrate God's greatness and dominance over humankind. The cathedrals also served as centers for learning, teaching many subjects interlinked with ecclesiastical doctrines. Cathedrals were also a demonstration of wealth, power, and prestige, not only for the church leaders but also for nobles and monarchs, as they served as symbols of their devotion and authority. Number 8. Pilgrimages were highly popular. During the medieval period, the prevailing opinion was that humans were inherently sinful and needed to seek repentance constantly. Pilgrimages were a way to show dedication to the divine, hoping their sins would be forgiven. While many shrines were for healing physical ailments, as sickness or injury were usually thought of as the result of sin, the underlying cause of pilgrimages was still to establish a connection with God. Pilgrims knew that any ailments would not be automatically cured by making a pilgrimage to a particular shrine, and failure to obtain a cure was usually attributed to the person's sinfulness. Pilgrimages were often seen as a manifestation of the journey to a spiritual goal, but this wasn't the only reason to embark on one. The Church also allowed pilgrims to purchase indulgences at certain pilgrim sites or to complete specific pilgrimage routes. This practice partly led to the Reformation, after which pilgrimages were considered unnecessary, as spiritual contact with God could be undertaken anywhere with a focus on internal spirituality rather than outward shows of devotion. Number 9. They took monasticism one step further. For some, the monastic lifestyle was still too indulgent, as the monastic community still owned land, property, and assets. In the 1200s, this led to a rise in the number of orders for mendicant friars. The two principal founders of these orders were St. Dominic, whose order was known as the Dominican order, and St. Francis of Assisi, who established the Franciscan order. Where monks and nuns focused on a life of prayers and solitude within the monastery's walls, the mendicant friars and sisters lived and worked within the community. They were encouraged to give up everything, including a permanent residence, and rely on their own work and the charity of others to survive. Although the mendicants had friaries that acted as headquarters, the friars and sisters were required to travel while living, preaching, and working in communities. While the monastic orders were largely self-sufficient and able to engage in agriculture to sustain their communities, the mendicant orders were supposed to live by the work of their hands, providing for themselves only when they needed to survive. In reality, many friars and sisters had to resort to begging for alms in order to sustain themselves. As the mendicant communities grew, it became harder to sustain themselves through personal work, especially since they were required to forego fixed income sources. The orders had to undergo successive reforms to maintain the viability of the mendicant lifestyle. Number 10. It saw the rise of medieval mysticism. Medieval mysticism encompassed diverse beliefs, experiences, and practices rooted in religious devotion. It flourished across Europe during the Middle Ages, with prominent figures including Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Meister Eckhart. Mystics came from various backgrounds, with some being part of the Friends of God movement, while others were hermits. They all demonstrated the spiritual variety and vigor of the age. Usually, mysticism involved personal encounters with God, seeking union with the divine, and varied expressions of spirituality. The mystic movement underwent drastic changes during the 14th and 15th centuries amid the social turmoil of the Black Death, peasant rebellions, and economic strife. During the rise of the Renaissance, new trends in intellectualism, culture, and philosophy contributed to the movement's decline. Do you agree with our list or have a captivating fact you'd like to share? Let us know in the comments below. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about Christianity in the Middle Ages, check out our book, Christianity in the Middle Ages, a captivating guide to the tales of Templars, trials of faith, and the tumult of Crusades. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.